Welcome back to the Weekend Report. I'm Masachaba Mposwa. Diplomatic ties between South Africa and Israel continue to be strained as the two countries have expelled each other's envoys. Now, shortly after the International Relations Department announced its expulsion of Israeli diplomat Ariel Seidman for what they describe as unacceptable violations of diplomatic norms and practices, Israel responded, calling the move a false attack on the country and its diplomat. Israel also declared South Africa's senior diplomat, Shaun Byneveldt, a persona non grata and gave him 72 hours to leave the country. Let's continue to get reaction to these developments with international relations expert and research fellow at Afrasid, Ayesha Kajee. Good morning. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika, Ayesha, and thank you so much for your time. Now, let's start here. Firstly, both South Africa and Israel being, declaring each other's senior diplomats persona non grata within hours of each other. Can you clearly explain to our viewers, just in layman's terms, what it means for a country to declare a former diplomat persona non grata, especially under international law?
Well, good morning, Masachaba, and good morning to your listeners as well. It's quite a farcical situation right now, actually, because South Africa, as you've said, declared Mr. Seidman persona non grata, and this was following close on the heels of engagements by senior Israeli people in the Eastern Cape following a visit sponsored by Israel to Israel by King Dali Nyembo. But South Africa said in its statements that, it didn't reference this issue directly, but it did say that Israel had continually disrespected the norms of international diplomatic cooperation by bypassing DIRCO and bypassing the official channels. It also mentioned, and this is true if you look at X and other social media platforms, that South African officials, including President Ramaphosa, have been consistently disrespected on these platforms, insulted on these platforms by Israeli diplomats and senior members of the Israeli government. Now, what's quite farcical is that after South Africa gave Mr. Seidman 72 hours to leave the country, Israel reciprocated by expelling our ambassador not to Israel, but to Palestine, which is a country, of course, that Israel occupies. So basically, they are they are hosting on behalf of Palestine, in Palestine, our diplomat, and they decided to expel him. That's Shaun Byneveldt. And as our own Department of International Relations and Cooperation has said, this is a really farcical situation. It highlights and underscores that Israel is an occupier of territory recognized globally under the international, rules-based order by the United Nations and many, many countries across the world. Palestine is recognized as a sovereign state, and it is therefore just underscoring its own occupation of Palestine by expelling the ambassador of South Africa to Palestine. So very farcical state of affairs. Unfortunately, one that is likely to have some severe repercussions for South Africans, but we can discuss those.
Now, Ayesha, you speak of disrespect. There are reports that an Israeli foreign ministry official, David Saranga, was in South Africa this week, and that Israeli officials met with King Ayesha Kajee in the Eastern Cape without notifying the South African government. Now, can you explain why unauthorized diplomatic visits pose such a serious challenge to South Africa's sovereignty?
Well, South Africa is a country with freedom of expression, freedom of political association, etc. But it is a country that is a democracy with an elected government, and that includes a Department of International Relations and Cooperation. So for another state to bypass the normal channels of communication and diplomacy that would be through DIRCO, basically is a slap in the face to the South African administration, and it is essentially an attempt by that country to exert political and other influence within the country through nefarious means, through non-diplomatic, non-official diplomatic channels. And therefore, in this particular case, the king, as I said earlier, went on a fully sponsored trip to Israel, came back and made very, very complimentary statements about Israel, despite the fact that practically every major human rights organization in the world, as well as several states, have agreed that there is a genocide, in fact, a Holocaust happening in Gaza, despite the so-called ceasefire. This in the face of the International Court of Justice ruling that there is a probable genocide happening in Gaza. And so Israel brings a senior diplomat, a senior official into the country to go and visit the area, currently under the administration of King Dalindyebo, and does not notify the South African government at all. Firstly, serious violation, as I said, of official diplomatic channels. But secondly, definitely an attempt to influence some senior South African figures, including the king himself, as well as perhaps members of that community, by bypassing these channels. So attempting to basically manipulate and exert soft power, both political and perhaps economic in the long term, and perhaps social, by bypassing these channels. Really not done, not in order, if you will. Firstly, not following the rules, but just really not courteous, not gentlemanly, not any of the sort of polite words I could use. It was seriously an infringement of the established order.
Right. Now, you mentioned something very important. South Africa having previously taken Israel to the International Court of Justice on genocide charges related to Gaza. How much of today's diplomatic crisis is a direct consequence of that legal action?
A large portion, I would say. I would say that Israel has been seeking an excuse to essentially insult South Africa, has done so on several occasions, but has really been extremely angered by this ICJ case. Remember that the ICJ, Masachaba, is the world's highest court. And in a near unanimous ruling, with only the Israeli judge and the Ugandan judge not agreeing, so near unanimous ruling, that court almost immediately after that case was brought, less than 4 months after that case was brought by South Africa, said that it had reason to believe, through all the evidence presented, that there was a probable genocide. There were grounds for believing that a genocide was occurring in Gaza. The ICJ did make rulings on what Israel ought to do. Of course, first and foremost, stop killing people. Israel has not complied. The ICJ has issued further so-called interim measures while it deliberates to make that legal ruling, which is a very specific ruling of genocide. But it has said that there is sufficient evidence for it to actually, believe that there is a strong possibility of this happening. As I said earlier, human rights organizations throughout the world, very well-respected ones from various parts of the political spectrum, have also asserted that genocide is occurring in Gaza. We've seen deliberate targeting of journalists, of humanitarian aid workers, of medical personnel. We've seen attempts to starve the Gazan population, to expel the Gazan population in various ways, including by sending them unauthorized to South Africa, some of them. So we've seen all these nefarious things happening in conjunction with a Holocaust in Gaza, which the ICJ has said there are strong grounds for believing is occurring. And of course, this has angered Israel and its allies. It's angered not only Israel, but in particular the United States of America, which has really toughened its own diplomatic stance on South Africa, and largely all due to South Africa having the courage, at the time the only country with the courage, now several other countries have joined in, but South Africa having the courage and knowing from its own experience of apartheid, to bring this case before the world's highest court. And that highest court of the global order has in fact said that there is a likelihood, a strong likelihood of genocide in Gaza. And this is, of course, really blown up in Israel's face. It's changed global opinion to a large extent, particularly among young people. Israel is frantically scrambling to win both the media war and the social media war by acquiring ownership of media and social media platforms in an attempt to redirect public opinion, especially, as I said, global youth opinion in its favor, but it has failed. And so it is resorting to these types of measures.
Ayesha, could this particular moment lead to a complete withdrawal of diplomatic representation between South Africa and Israel? Or is this an expulsion of individuals who will just simply be replaced by new diplomats?
Well, there is always that possibility of the replacement of diplomats by new diplomats, more acceptable, if we want to say that, to both sides. But given that this expulsion is not based on the personalities involved, as the expulsion, for example, of former ambassador to the US, Ibrahim Rasool, was from the US. It's not a personal thing. It's not about Mr. Seidman or Mr. Byneveldt per se. It is about the actions of Israel more broadly in South Africa, and then a tit for tat by Israel against the South African representative to Palestine, as I said, not to Israel, but to Palestine, that has blown up. I think the possibility of this being softened and glossed over is fairly low at this point in time. And given that the genocide in Gaza is ongoing, given that the violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem by Israel against Palestinians is ongoing, and given that South Africa has taken very strong steps to ensure its own sovereignty in the international relations arena, we will not submit to a type of neo-colonialism, if you will, by either Israel or the United States when it comes to internal matters, as the matter in the Eastern Cape was, or foreign policy matters more generally, international relations matters more generally. We have to maintain our sovereignty. Israel, of course, and again, by extension, its major ally, the United States, are also very, very concerned about South Africa's influence in the BRICS coalition, about the fact that while the United States is still the world's superpower, as it were, that many countries, including within its most, the United States and Israel's most reliable former allies, including within the European Union, many countries are now looking towards other coalitions. They're looking towards other large powers, such as Russia, such as China, such as India, and even, dare I say it, such as South Africa. We may not be a huge power in trade terms, but we certainly, as South Africans, given our history and given our process of reconciliation and our route to democracy, we do, as a country, fight above our weight in diplomatic terms in global circles. What South Africa says, what South Africa does, garners attention from the rest of the world. And that goodwill and that punching above our weight in those international relations circles is not taken lightly by observers around the world, and thus not taken lightly by both Israel and the United States.
All right, so now let's discuss this. Once a country declares a diplomat persona non grata, is there a time frame for that political abyss, if I can call it that? And also, are there any processes in terms of conflict resolution when such a fallout occurs?
Well, generally, the country that announces the expulsion does give a time frame. In this case, South Africa has said that Mr. Seidman is required to leave the country within 72 hours. The tit for tat from Israel expelling Mr. Byneveldt from Ramallah, which I will once again emphasize is the Palestinian in the occupied Palestinian territory. So he's the ambassador to Palestine, not Israel, but Israel, because it occupies Palestine, is essentially able to kick Mr. Byneveldt out. Israel has also said 72 hours. Past that 72 hours, the attempts to then reconcile generally happen within a week to 2 weeks behind the scenes. If those attempts are going to happen, that is where they'll happen, when they'll happen. And then beyond that, sometimes, not always, there is a third party that brokers those attempts. That third party could be a regional or international grouping. It could, for example, be the United Nations or one of the United Nations organizations. However, given that Israel has shown its contempt for the rules-based global order and for the United Nations itself in the last 2 years, I think that we're not going to see that happen via United Nations bodies. We may well see it happening via a third country. The most likely from Israel's viewpoint would be the United States. But given that South Africa's relationship with the US has soured greatly since Mr. Trump took office in January last year, we're again unlikely to see such a move welcomed by the South African contingent, or even perhaps even tried by the Israelis. So, that leaves a couple of, shall we say, more neutral actors, some of them in Europe, some of them in the global South, but it remains to be seen whether any such third-party intervention could have a chance of success. The only terms under which that might have a chance for success is perhaps, for some of the countries that have become increasingly belligerent towards South Africa in the wake of the ICJ case,
Sure.
to review some of their economic actions, which have had consequences not only for South Africans, I must emphasize, but also for the citizens of those countries. So, for example, if you take the new tariffs, or the fairly new tariffs that the US has imposed on South Africa, in the automotive industry, they've had a killing effect on South Africa's automotive industry. Although in recent months, again, some of that space has been taken up by Chinese and Indian companies, a move that I think the US did not expect. But that's also had a repercussion on car prices in the US itself, on the US's both export of certain materials and import of others into the US, and has had consequences for American citizens that I think Mr. Trump's administration did not consider carefully. So if those types of tariffs were used, or a lowering of those tariffs were used as the carrot to bring South Africa and Israel to the diplomatic negotiation table, as it were,
All
there
right.
might be some chance of success.
Thanks, Ayesha. So we're running out of time, but now some members of the GNU have been openly supportive of Israel, even conducting delegations to that country. Now, how does this internal divergence within the GNU complicate South Africa's official foreign policy messaging on Israel's actions?
Well, those members of the GNU have not, unfortunately, been held to their agreement within the GNU, those who have violated the official foreign policy stance of South Africa. And given this is an encouraging development that South Africa has protected its sovereignty and basically said to Israel, you cannot go and do this through backdoor channels. You cannot conduct diplomacy without the official Department of International Relations informed and involved. South Africa, the major partner in the South African GNU, needs to actually say that very, very clearly to its partners in the GNU as well, to say, you cannot do this. And if you do this, there will be consequences, and have visible consequences, not only for South African citizens at large to be able to see, but also for the parties that make up that GNU to actually say, well, we're not going to attempt this again, because these consequences have been severe.
All right. Ayesha, thank
Of
you
course,
so
you
much.
know, without breaking up the GNU.
Sure.
Yes.
We'll leave it right there. Thank you so much for your time.